Thanks for coming out. I'm going to introduce Aran and Ian, and I'm just going to let them do their thing because they know lots of stuff. Aran Shetterly grew up in rural Maine, studied English literature and Spanish language and culture at Harvard College, earned an MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. His first book, The Americano, Fighting with Castro's of Cuba's Freedom, received a star review, Publishers Weekly. Morningside, the book you'll be talking about tonight, had the support. The project was supported by the Virginia Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. Aran lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, with his wife, Margo Lee Shetterly, author of the New York Times #1 bestseller, Hidden Figures, and their son, Giles. Ian McDowell earned his MFA in Creative Writing and his MA in English at UNCG. He's published 2 novels, Margaret's Curse and Merwin's Gift, and his short fiction has been featured in Love in Vain, Years Best Far, and the Science Fiction Book Club's Best Short Novels of 2005. He writes for the Triad-based weekly Yes Weekly, and in 2020 he won first place in investigative journalism from the NC Press Association Black articles on the police homicide of Marcus Smith. He's also written about the case from the Assembly and the police misconduct, civil rights law issues. Please welcome Aran Ian.
Hey, Aran. Am I on? Yes. Hi, Aran.
Am I on? Yeah. Hi, everybody. Hello. Thanks for being here on a beautiful day. I just want to say thank you to Scuppernong before we start.
Yes.
Scuppernong has been the hub of my work in Greensboro since this project started, probably even before. And I've been coming here and drinking coffee, buying books, and receiving moral and practical support all along the way as I worked on Morningside. So I'm extremely grateful to Steve and Brian and everyone who worked here, and for this wonderful space where I felt completely able to think whatever I wanted to think about what I was learning. This guy I count as a friend now, who I've gotten to know in my time in Greensboro. And there are a lot of things that Steve didn't mention, but I want to mention one. You know, I remember when this guy I was working with at one point said, you know, there are different kinds of dogs. There's the dog that chases the car, and then there's the dog that chases the car and bites the tire. That's the kind we want, the tire biter. And Ian is a tire biter. I mean, 50 articles, all right, about the Marcus Smith case. That is incredible persistence, and we are all well served for that kind of journalistic persistence, perseverance, and resilience. And so the first question what we're going to do here is I'm going to interview Ian for about 15 minutes, and he's going to interview me for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up and we can all have a conversation. I mean,
We don't need no stinking moderator.
Yeah, this is a perfect sized group for a great conversation. If anyone wants to move closer, we won't spit or bite. And I don't think
You won't.
so.
You said you had a biter.
Yes, that's right. But unless you're wearing a tire. You're right, you've got me. So I would parachute into Greensboro to do this research and stay most of the time with Lewis Pitts and SPOMA, which was my other space here where I could engage this subject. And I'm extremely grateful to them for hosting me as I did this work. Thank you. But I would be here for a week or two, do research, interview people, and then I drive up 29 back to Charlottesville, Virginia. You have been investigating how power works in the place you live and challenging official narratives in the place you live. And I was wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about what that experience is like, how it makes you feel, and what the advantages and perhaps challenges of that are.
Thanks, Aran. I went in despite having lived here since I've lived here since '81 when I came up to UNCG to first go to grad school. But my mom was from here, her father was from here and lived with us after she died in Fayetteville. And he would bring me up to Greensboro well before the Greensboro massacre. He would bring me up here on weekends to work at his brother's poultry farm at the corner of Friendly and Holden, where I spent lots of summers plucking chickens.
We never came downtown to the Woolworths in the 70s. I turned 67 this month. But we never came downtown to the Woolworths because other than my late mother, her side of the family was pretty racist. And I heard a lot of BS narratives before I heard the BS narratives about 1979. So we would go to Woolworths out at Friendly Shopping Center. And so I just had this stories about Greensboro with a lot of things that I won't get into now that were not true. But I knew Greensboro a bit when I came here in '81, and I did not come here with the intention of being a journalist. I kind of drifted into it in the early 2000s, and even then it was basically anecdotal history and literary nonfiction, that kind of thing. I began doing serious journalism in 2016, and in 2018 I heard about the Marcus Smith case, and as Marcus may be less familiar to some of y'all than the Greensboro Massacre, he was the black man who in November of 2018 was fatally hogtied by the Greensboro police during the first North Carolina Folk Festival. And the city issued a press release saying that he had collapsed in custody and that he'd been suicidal and that he died on Church Street. None of those things were true. And I did not really realize I was pushing back in my early reportage on this. In my earliest reportage, I didn't know what had happened. And it wasn't until I attended an event hosted by Reverend Nelson Johnson, who is one of the links between our two books, was it New Zion Church? It was not Beloved Community Center, but when they first released in December of 2018 the video, an unprecedented thing happened. The videos were actually publicly released. The over 20 body cam videos of Marcus's death were released. And I saw apparently an enraged Mayor Nancy Vaughn say that that original press release was a lie. And she said it 7 times in the course of 4 minutes. With Nelson keeping the angry crowd from berating her and making them be polite to her. And Nancy said she was going to get to the bottom of this and that the press release had obviously been a lie and there were consequences. There would be consequences for that lie. Within 48 hours, she walked back that story and said that she'd only used the word lie because the crowd was using it and that she never meant to say that it was a lie. And in the depositions that Attorney Graham Holt and Flint Taylor conducted with Mayor Vaughn, there are 14 pages, or at least in the redacted version of the deposition I got, there were 14 pages of her trying to walk back her calling it a lie. And that was my first experience of pushing back against an official narrative.
And was that a hard thing to do emotionally, or how did you feel about doing that in public, in the paper?
It was a hard thing to do. Nancy was and is a friend. She had, I spent many years working at Kinko's and then FedEx, and I'm fine now, but when I was diagnosed with leukemia, the same kind of leukemia that killed my mother, in 2013, Nancy and her soon-to-be ex-husband contributed to my cancer fund. Mayor Vaughn has always been very good to me. I did not like pressing on that issue, but I had to. And unfortunately, I wish I'd pressed more at the time. I certainly pressed her on in my book. But at the time of my initial reporting, I'd only seen a snippet. I'd not been at that press conference, at that community meeting. So I'd only seen a snippet of the video. And I did not realize how many times she had actually used the word lie. It wasn't until I was writing the book in 2023 that I actually saw the full video of how Nelson conducted that meeting and of how long Mayor Vaughn stressed that the original press release was an LIE.
Which it was, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a lie.
How did this experience, and you have this journey of learning about this case, right?
Yes.
And you're going deeper and deeper into it, and you're learning more and more about what happened and how it happened, and then the actions around it, the sort of the covering up of what happened of this case, right? And you're writing journalism. How did this case sort of affect you personally, and how did you grow as a journalist working on this?
I would hope that I learned to be more skeptical of official narratives. Mm-hmm. I learned to press for things. I got some experience of standing up to pressure, brought by people who were very politely trying to tell me that I was wrong or that I was or in the case of a city attorney, were possibly not so politely trying to tell me that I was wrong. And yeah, I mean, it was an organic process. I mean, I never intended to write 60. It was actually about maybe 57 articles, and I never intended to write a book until Scuppernong asked me to. And once I was writing the book, I thought of all the questions I had not asked at the time. For instance, I did not interview District 1 Sharon Hightower at any length about the Marcus Smith case until I was writing the book, as I'm sure the attorneys of the Smith family wished probably that they had had a deposition of Ms. Hightower. I wish I had questioned her much more closely back in 2018 and 2019, because in 2023, she was telling me that it was a flat-out cover-up and that the cover-up extended beyond the police chief to city council and the city manager, and that she had been silenced in speaking about this at city council meetings. I had no inkling of any of that in 2018.
So, Ian, tell us a little more. So you've set the scene of what happened in the case, the hog tying, essentially the murder on the street, the lie of the press release. How did this then play out over time, and who were some of the important players in that?
Well, it was first introduced to me by an activist named Marcus Hyde, who was because he lived on my street, or around the corner on my street, the Homeless Union of Greensboro. And there were possibly issues with my friend Marcus and Marcus Hyde and the Homeless Union that are kind of outside of the scope of this discussion. But he said there was a man whom was hogtied to death by the police. They haven't released the video yet, but when they do, it's going to be explosive. And when I first saw that video, and when I first met attorney Graham Holt, who talked about the video, I saw some things I did not expect of this man pleading for help, saying he couldn't breathe, begging them to stop holding him face down in Church Street. I saw him appear to die right there on Church Street, even though the city kept saying that he had died at the hospital later. After collapsing, actually, he was having an agitated mental state. He had paranoid delusions. He, as homeless people may do, he medicated himself with street drugs sometimes, and he was having a paranoid episode. He asked these officers after the folk festival to take him to the hospital, and the officers, let him get in the back of a police car. On the video, he can be seen getting agitated by the flashing lights on top. The officers shining lights on him in the car. They decide that they need to restrain him before he takes the ambulance to the hospital. The ambulance that's arriving to the hospital, they open the door, and when he gets out of the police car, the officers dogpile him, bear him to the ground, start applying this device in which his ankles are restrained and attached to his handcuffs behind his back while his body is bowed in this kind of position with his feet approaching the small of his back, and he appears to die. And later, In depositions, one of the EMTs said that it was her belief that he died there on the street at that time, which was just my layman's observation. And I got to know, I mean, I'd heard of Nelson Johnson before, but I'd never dealt with Nelson. I'd never spoken to him before. I not grew up, but I'd been introduced by my faculty at the English department at UNCG and at Carolina before that to some BS myths about the massacre, that it was a shootout between two rival out-of-town gangs. And Nelson had been kind of demonized by some of these figures. That was not the man I met. That was not the man I saw introduced talking to that crowd. I got to know Graham Holt and Flint Taylor. I got to know the Smith family, Mary Smith, Marcus's mother, and a little bit. She has a statement that she wants to make about the late Reverend Johnson, whom she feels and we all feel was. I mean, he's a link between these two cases, but he was instrumental in introducing the Smith family to their legal team. I thought the Smiths were such really great people, such nice people, and not deserving of some of the things being said about them by city council, among others. I got to know people like Sherazar Crippen, Irving Allen, I didn't realize till much later, had been shut up when they were on GC Jack, which stands for Greensboro Justice Advisory Committee, I think. And Mayor Vaughn was telling Mary Smith that she needed to take her case to GC Jack, and there was no need for the city to conduct an investigation. And Irv and Sherazar stood up in front of council and said that this was not true, that GC Jack would have no investigative power, that anything they discovered would be silenced, that if they talked even to council about what they learned through an investigation, they could be fined $500 and sentenced to 50 days in jail. And right at the next meeting after they spoke, District 2's Goldie Wells said she wanted Irving Allen and Sherazar Crippen removed from GC Jack for, in Goldie's words, reasons. Basically because she stood up and she talked against the mayor's narrative. I can't prove that. I'm sure they would tell you that if they were here. But yeah, I mean, I could go on and on and on. But
what was the eventual outcome?
So I'll preamble that a little bit by saying that right before the Smith family announced the lawsuit, that Representative at Large Michelle Kennedy and possibly more crucially, District 1 Sharon Hightower called for an independent investigation. Mayor Vaughn agreed that there should be one, modeled on the one in Charlottesville after what happened there. And that as soon as the lawsuit was announced, the city said they could not have an independent investigation while they were being sued, even though Charlottesville had conducted one while they were being sued by both fascist and Antifa, or whatever you want to call them, by fascists and anti-fascists, they were being sued by both sides. And the city had basically said they should have an investigation modeled on this, but as soon as the lawsuit happened, not going to be an investigation. It wound its way through depositions, through some false statements by the city attorney, who said that the Smith family had been offered a $3 million settlement. He told city council that, not the public, while telling the public that Marcus's life was worth a low six figures. That the attorneys can tell you that they were never offered that settlement at that time. And it was after, I guess it was Dateline NBC got interested and had a brief interview with Mary Smith. The city freaked out a bit. Michelle Kennedy stood up in front of council and made her second statement, apologizing for tabling her previous motion the year before for an independent investigation, and this time demanding an independent investigation to both the death of Marcus Smith and the GPD. Within 6 weeks of that, she had been offered a job as the director of neighborhood development that paid her over twice what she was making as head of the IRC, and she stepped down from council without completing her term. And there was finally a settlement, and the family got an amount that was well, the family and Marcus's grandchildren and various people got a settlement that was over $2 million. And there was a marker installed at the IRC that now, depending on what will happen with the IRC, we don't know about that, what that marker's future is. The city accepted no wrongdoing. Part of the settlement was not acknowledging any wrongdoing, but making a statement that Marcus's life had mattered. And I think it would have been resolved sooner and maybe more strongly if it had gotten more traction. Marcus died 2 years before the George Floyd protest. During those protests, lots of people even here in Greensboro were saying they never heard of Marcus Smith. Friends who had connections at the New York Times found resistance from the New York Times covering it. So 3 different friends pitched this story to the New York Times and were told different versions of, well, it's too common a story. It happens in every city. There's nothing unusual about the police killing a black man. And it never, beyond the Dateline, NBC, or whichever network thing it was, it did not get that much national attention. If it did, I think it would have, ended sooner.
First of all, Ian, what was the city covering up, and why?
The city was covering up, as the attorneys Flint Taylor and Graham Holt found, even though their attempts to disclose this during the discovery process were somewhat suppressed by actions of the city attorneys. They found that hundreds of people, mostly black men, had been, this device, I should backtrack, the device used on Marcus was called the rip hobble. And it was a device for connecting shackles on the ankle shackles to handcuffs behind the subject's back. As activist Hester Petty found when she ordered one, and as I found when I independently ordered one from the manufacturer, it came with a disclaimer saying, never use this to hogtie a person. You should use the ankle straps to restrain their legs from kicking while they're in a seated position in a police car. In other words, the instructions that came with it said not to use it in the way it had been used. There were police training manuals saying don't use it that way. Yet the police had used it that way, and they had used it on hundreds of people. And the city managed to suppress attempts to get those videos released or even described in detail.
What did you learn about how power works, and specifically about how power works in Greensboro over the course of this project?
One thing I learned is that the police, the city manager, and the city attorney have more power than you would expect. And it is my belief that they could convince a mayor to change her public statement.
There are a lot of people, there are people in this room, and maybe more than I even realize, who played a significant part. This is Graham Holt, the lawyer that, Graham, you want to put your hand up there? The lead lawyer on this case. This is Lewis Pitts, who was behind the scenes on this, working on this. And who else was involved? I mean, Spoma, you were involved? Absolutely.
Hester Petty.
Yep.
Is Hester here?
There wouldn't have been a market for 57 stories by him if Hester didn't lead the street protest that kept the story alive. Every
Yes.
Monday.
Great point.
It was a good thing to remember. Protests work, maybe not right away.
Yeah, so that's perfect segue to my next question, is we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about journalists. How did the public in Greensboro support what you were doing and, in a sense, enable it, beginning with Hester Petty, but also the Beloved Community Center and others who were involved?
Well, Hester, I mean, that's another example of my naivety being surprised or counteracted. I didn't know Hester when she got up in front of City Council, and my copy of the Rip Hybel had not arrived yet. It arrived a day after she spoke to City Council. I had already ordered one, but she got up and gave council. She put on the screen on the projector the instructions that said, "Do not use these to this device to hogtie somebody," and City Council showed no interest And at this time, Hester was criticizing, in fact, to me, she criticized some activists for shouting at council, for cussing them out. She actually called for more decorum during meetings. She addressed council very respectfully. And yet she was presenting them with evidence that this device had been used in a way that it's manufactured. I mean, the company that makes the rib hobble, the man who invented this device, his daughter was leading a public campaign to warn police agencies not to hogtie people with it because it would get them sued. I mean, let's be honest, they weren't, I don't know that they were a pro-police company. They weren't necessarily trying to save lives, but they were trying to keep cops from getting sued. And they'd been doing it ever since the Justice Department warned against hogtying in that fashion in 1999. And Hester had incontrovertible evidence of this. Nobody on council expressed a single interest in it, never made any statements about it. Those first meetings in the first year after Marcus's death, I mean, there was a lie told in the Rhino Times that the same 6 people showed up at every meeting and talked about Marcus. There were 6, I counted over the course of the first year, something like 97 distinct individuals who spoke to council, a lot of them younger people from A&T. As the case wore on, as younger people graduated or moved away, the face of public protest grew somewhat older and possibly less diverse, just because we had the diehards in there. But early on, there was a massive public outcry against, even though at the same time, so many people did not know about it. A year into the case, I talked to the rapper and music historian Demeanor, the nephew of Rhiannon Giddens, while he was still a student at A&T, and he said, "We don't know about this at A&T." And I asked him why, and he said, "Well, it's a bunch of older folks talking about it on Facebook. We don't pay attention to Facebook. You've got to get on Twitter if you want us to pay attention." And Demeanor worked on publicizing it. But according to this was him saying this, he said, "My classmates don't know about Marcus Smith." That's not really, I mean, he was seeing one perspective. We saw lots of A&T students in those first few months who were coming to city council, and Goldie Wells was yelling at them for not respecting their betters and not respecting the people like her who had fought for civil rights in the 60s. So yes, there were very activist A&T students talking about this. But at the same time, there were plenty who hadn't heard of it. There were plenty of people at my alma mater, UNCG, as the years wore on, still had not heard anything about it. What was the question? I'm sorry.
No, how the grassroots in a sense
Yes,
booing
and the
and
Mondays,
push the case
Mondays
along.
for Marcus by Gary and Hester and others were critical, were instrumental. They kept at it Monday after Monday after Monday. Lewis's efforts were critical. Lewis put me in touch with some very important people. As Mary Smith will tell you.
Yeah, feel free.
I'll read it. I'll read it.
Yeah.
Mary Smith wanted me to read this statement. Sorry, it's going to take me just a moment. But it's something that, for space reasons, got cut out of my article on Nelson Johnson and his passing. Mary Smith said that she and her family will always be grateful to the Johnsons, to Nelson and Joyce, for working for justice for her late son, Marcus Smith, and that, quote, "it was like a piece of my heart fell out when she learned of Nelson's death. The moment we met Reverend Johnson, he welcomed our broken hearts with open arms. God sent us in the right direction when we had no other place to go. His wife Joyce also welcomed us. It also welcomed us when we thought there was no one to love us in our darkness. We will forever be grateful to the Johnsons and the beloved community center." There's an important historical link between the Greensboro massacre and the death of Marcus Smith right there.
One more question, Ian, and then we can switch roles,
Yes.
switch hats perhaps. Here we are in this moment that requires good reporting, it requires protest, it requires everything we can imagine in order to resist some of what is happening in this country right now. And I'm wondering if there are any lessons to take away from the Marcus Smith, I mean, as we've just talked about, with good lawyers, with grassroots, with that we can take away and place some hope in?
Persistence. People so persisted in this, whether it was Mondays for Marcus people, whether it was the much more than 6 people who talked at every council meeting, but kept talking. And when they started moving council meetings around, and you can never convince me that this was not an attempt to silence the Marcus Smith advocates. The council, Mayor Vaughn, the city attorney decided that council meetings should start taking place at rec centers at a rec center each month, a different one in a different district. And originally they were saying that these would not be telecast live on the city's website or on public access TV, that there would be an audio recording that might be available days later. And because I and the reporters at Trad City Beat and others pressed back against that, the claim was that only recordings made in the city council chamber could be rendered in real time. That it was a different, and this may be true, this probably is true, that it took longer and it would be a different process putting them online if they were recorded with mobile equipment. But they weren't going to record them on video at all, if not for that. And that's one reason why, they never shrunk to just 6, but that's a major reason why the group of people speaking, the city council shrunk, because the city was taking it to rec center, to rec center, to rec center. But people need to persist. And people were on this before I was. I can't express how strongly it was important that Jordan Green was there first for Trad City Beat. He got some very important interviews with people at the Interactive Resource Center that knew Marcus, that contradicted something Ms. Kennedy told me, which was that Mary Smith had never, I shouldn't have said that, but I'll say it. Michelle claimed that Mary Smith had never come to see Marcus at the IRC. 3 different Black employees of the IRC told Jordan, and later Sayaka Matsuka at Trad City Beat, and told me that Mary was a regular visitor to the IRC. And and Jordan and Sayaka were on that. Rich Barron for the News and Record did probably some of the last major reporting. We all know that our daily newspaper is dying and has been a shadow of itself since 2014. But even in its waning days, Rich was doing the kind of reporting that they had not done in a while. He went out on Easter to spend it with the Smith family in South Carolina, and that became, a front page story in the Easter Sunday edition. And he kept at it to his retirement. And so there was far more people on this than just me. And there were people who were on this before I was, and their efforts were invaluable. Lewis is working to publicize this. Hester, we've already mentioned, and people like Sherazar and Irving. There was so much, people kept at it. People did not shut up despite efforts to shut them up.
We barely scratched the surface, honestly, of this history. It's so important and so complex. And so I recommend everyone you get a copy of Ian's book, I Ain't Resistant, which I assume are right up here for sale.
At the cash register,
and,
yes.
And learn more deeply even about this case here and the heroes who kept it alive until there was a settlement. So,
yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, we've talked about, I've mentioned, people who did not, because there are always going to be people who haven't heard of something. We still have people in Greensboro, quite a few people in Greensboro who have not heard of the Greensboro Massacre. And God knows outside of Greensboro who have not heard of it. Aran will be the first to tell you about that. Tell us about how you learned of it.
So I was here in 2015 to accompany my father, who's a painter, who had a show of his Americans Who Tell the Truth paintings at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. And the woman who organized that exhibit said, there are 2 people you have to meet. So we walked from the Woolworths and the Civil Rights Center and Museum about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile to Manny's Universal Cafe. And I didn't really realize at the time the significance that we had to leave that space to go somewhere else to hear this story. but that's worth talking about a little bit at some point. And we sat down at this cafe, and we waited and waited. We were about to walk out the door, and all of a sudden, the door opened, and out of the bright September sun came Reverend Nelson Johnson and Joyce Johnson. And they sat down, they started to tell us about their lives and their story and about what happened in 1979. And that, you know, as they were setting up for a march against the racism that they were encountering in the mills as they were trying to organize them here in Greensboro, still some of the largest textile mills in the world, producing Levi's jean material for over 100 years. They were setting up, and on this November 3rd, 1979, all of a sudden a caravan of 9 cars drove through, fired a shot, picked a fight, and in 88 seconds, 5 people were dead and another dozen or so injured. And then they talked about how after that, in the wake of that, they lost their jobs. They became pariahs in Greensboro. They were blamed for the deaths of their friends. And then they told us about the state murder trial in which all the shooters were acquitted, and then the federal criminal civil rights trial in which everyone was acquitted again. And then finally, with the lawyers that they were able to choose, including Lewis Pitts, leading that team, they eked out a sliver of justice in which, as far as I know, the only time in American history Nazis, Klansmen, and local police officers were held jointly liable for death. And I'm sitting there in this cafe hearing this story thinking, what? How do I not know about this? And it was a pretty extraordinary feeling that grew in me. And a couple years later, when I had a chance to think about working on a big project, I got in touch with the Johnsons, and I came down and I sat with them and I said, would you trust me to try to tell this story? And would you help me so I can tell your piece of part of this story? And I didn't really realize when they said yes at that point what I was asking for, and the number of times that they had been betrayed by journalists over the years, and how difficult it was for them to get their story as they believed it to be true out. And that began my journey into what this book, which, you know, I thought, well, this will take me a couple years and I'll do this. And it ended up taking 7 because it's such a big story and it can go anywhere, I found, in American history. I mean, there's almost nowhere this story doesn't connect to. And so figuring out how to tell that and how to not tell a book that is 5,000 pages long and that no one will even touch was hard to do. But I'm so grateful. It was such a privilege to get to spend time with them and get to spend time in Greensboro and get to spend time with all the people connected with this history and really learn about it and become changed by it.
Thank you. I've mentioned, and that was a great summation there. I cannot imagine the work Aran put into this. I can't even begin. I mean, I thought it was too hard. I mean, I thought it was hard and long. The year and a half I took writing my book, but his, I can't imagine. But I mentioned the official pushback we had early on that was kind of squelched in the Marcus Smith case. I mean, it wasn't, and to my shame, it wasn't until several years later that I actually watched the city council video in which Sharon Hightower called for an independent investigation. Well, actually, she said that the city attorney, Tom Carruthers, had silenced her in an effort to call for an independent investigation. And it wasn't until, again, years later that I watched the video of Goldie Wells calling for Irving and Sherazar to be kicked off the city committee that was supposed to investigate police malfeasance. But there were people pressing. There was even Michelle Kennedy pressing for the independent investigation, even though it was shut down before it happened. So when was the first time that there was ever in Greensboro municipal politics and people in power an actual call for clarity and transparency about what happened in 1979? How long did it take?
Wow.
Or an admission that something bad, an admission.
So that's interesting. Probably people here know this, live this history more than I did. Well, let me answer the question this way. One of the things that made this, my book and my research possible, was the Truth and Reconciliation process that happened here from 2004 to 2006. The first time in the United States that a Truth and Reconciliation process on the South African model took place. And it was sort of a test to see, well, can we take this to the United States and get traction with this? Well, that had no support from the city government. And as what I understand is that there was even, I mean, this sounds almost comical, but not in the current context, that there was a vote to not even read the final report, right, that was produced by the Truth Commission, which is a marvelous, astoundingly well done document, and that guided my research in a lot of ways. So there are people who would say, and I've heard this, well, that Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't really accomplish very much. And I completely disagree with that statement, because what that doesn't take into account is how long it takes change to happen, in a way, and what that impact is, and what the fact of that document's existence enables and forces to some degree. So there were a number of there was an expression of regret about the 1979 shooting, I think, but that the city council made in maybe 2009. And then what's interesting is I live in Charlottesville. And in 2017, we had a very similar episode happen in Charlottesville. The Unite the Right rally, good people on both sides. Yes, right. And the death of an anti-fascist activist. And a couple days later, in Greensboro, someone in city council, I'm sure there were a lot of people who spoke, but someone stood up and said, Greensboro, as city council was expressing a sympathy with Charlottesville, someone stood up and said, Greensboro is prologue. We can't forget that. This happened here, and now it's happened there. And in that immediate wake, the city council sort of issued a somewhat spontaneous apology, but didn't say what they were apologizing for. Then 2020 happens. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. We're taking race and our racial history more seriously for a period of time. And the city council, in a quite powerful and moving moment over Zoom, because we're in the depth of COVID, and I'm clicking on because I'm well into the work on this book at this point, apologizes and says that the Greensboro Police Department could have prevented the deaths that day. And then they name a scholarship, right, for each of the 5 people killed. So here we are in a city that has a scholarship named 4 of the 5 were active members of the Communist Workers' Party, named for communists, and in a city that's apologized. Now, I don't believe that apology could possibly have happened without the Truth and Reconciliation process that set the stage for that happening, 14 years later. But there's also, we don't look back at this past in order to just understand the past. It's in order to shape the future and to prevent things like this from happening again. And the Truth and Reconciliation Committee made many recommendations, and actually a number of those things, at least partially, have been, the city has tried to address. So, and I think that roadmap that was laid out at that time was extremely important to that. So,
but remember that we have elections coming up, and when that apology was issued, there were 2 dissenters. Now, Zach Matheny was not on city council at that time. He probably would have dissented because he dissented when the city approved a historical marker. Mr. Matheny objected to the word massacre at the time. But in 2020, Mary Kay Abuzuader, who's running for mayor, and Nancy Hoffman, who's my representative in District 4, they refused to, they were the two votes against the apology on the grounds they objected to the apology stating the city and the police's acquiescence and complicity. Those weren't the words, but that's what it was saying. It was basically acknowledging police complicity in allowing the massacre to happen. The police, because a police informer had led the Klan Nazi caravan to the murder scene, had notified his superior, and the cops pulled back anyway and let the massacre happen. There's really no other way to put it. And so we had somebody who may be our next mayor, refusing to acknowledge that that happened. And I remember one council, because I can't remember which one it was, and I'm not accusing anybody of anything, but one council member, when we were talking about Yvonne Johnson after her death, said that Yvonne Johnson, another council member, one of her dear colleagues, said that Yvonne had begged several council members to read the Truth and Reconciliation report, and that they refused, even through 2020, to read it.
You know, this is why history is getting erased, right? Because if you actually read the history and deal with the history at some level, your mind is probably going to change. You're going to be more open to what happened and what the realities are on the ground today. I want to hold out, just going back to the Truth and Reconciliation process again, it was a remarkable achievement of civil society here in Greensboro. I think that's really important to emphasize, without government support. And that's something we need to be thinking about now, right? Like, what can we do as civil society? And this was a remarkable achievement on Greensboro's part, and something Greensboro should be extremely proud of. There should be a plaque, if there isn't, as Greensboro has plaques for things in its history that have happened that are important. The other thing I'll say is, when it came to that apology, one of the people I interviewed was a city council person who helped craft that apology, named Tammy Thurm. And this is an example of the power of history, right? When I interviewed her, what she told me is that she had been a assistant to one of the lawyers defending the Klan in the state murder trial in 1979. And she completely believed that really it was the CWP, the Communist Workers' Party folks, that were to blame for this. The Klan had been baited into a shootout, and we can get into more of that if you want, but that's completely false. And so she had believed this. And then she went through this process of being educated in this community by people who lived this history, people who understood this history, the Truth and Reconciliation report. And she changed her mind to the point where she helped write this apology. Now, that to me is a journey that is incredibly powerful, because we need people to make journeys like that, but they can't do it unless the history is documented.
You've given me an example of that already. In researching your book, in interviewing for your book, did anybody else tell you that they had changed their mind over time? Yeah, in fact, this goes back to Scuppernong. I came into Scuppernong one day, and Brian Lampton said, I have this former Greensboro police officer who might be interesting for you to talk to. And I said, oh, okay, I'm talking to anybody. And so it turns out he put me in touch with this man, and this man named Greg Brooks became incredibly important to me as I went through this. He joined the police force in '77 and was on it until '87. And so I would come to him with questions about culture. Could this really have happened this way? What was this police officer like? What was that police officer like? And he was incredibly generous with his time. But when I showed up, he had a narrative. And it was
to some degree to the official narrative here. If this was extremist groups fighting. He also would say that a black captain on the Greensboro police force named Trevor Hampton was the one who was responsible for a low profile order, which meant that there were no police anywhere near at hand within sight when the Klan caravan came through. That was a police decision for there not to be police there, not an accident. And Trevor Hampton was not the one responsible, this black police officer, for making that decision. That came from the very top of the department. So Greg told me all these things. And so I was going back and forth with him over the course of years, telling him what I'd learned, asking him for feedback. And I'll read you a text he just sent me, in fact, part of it, because he just finished reading the book. And here, let me find it, because it's pretty interesting to hear this from a Greensboro police officer. Sorry, coming. Okay, I'm learning a lot. And I knew that he had made most of this journey already, but here's what he says I'm learning a lot and feeling misinformed, misled, and happy to learn what really went down. So, there weren't very many police officers who were willing to talk to me as I worked on this story. And so to have, in a sense, both his assistance and then, in a sense, his validation of the fact that he trusts what I put down in the book and what we put down in the book this community, through me, in a lot of ways, I found validating and important.
Am I correctly remembering that you got feedback about the book from an FBI agent who felt that you had not demonized him?
I was really fortunate to find the FBI agent who was in charge of the FBI investigation of what happened in 1979. Now, at the time, what they say is this was one of the 3 largest FBI investigations in American history. There was the JFK assassination, which is in the news again with all the releases that are happening. Some interesting things, actually, it seems. Pine Ridge, so the Native American 1973, what happened there, also with the FBI, and Greensboro. Now, it's interesting, and you could say it about all 3, but certainly Pine Ridge and Greensboro. Why were these investigations so big? Wasn't necessarily to solve the case. And I can say pretty surely in the Greensboro case, it was to find out as much as could be found out about the Communist Workers' Party and put them out of business. And that's why that investigation kept going. But I found the guy who had led that, and his name is Cecil Moses. And he is a farmer now in Tennessee. He joined the FBI in 1957, and I think retired in 89 or 90. So he had this tremendously long FBI career, rose to be one of the top 100 people in the whole Bureau, came up under Hoover, and was extremely accessible and completely willing to tell me his point of view about how the world worked and why what he did was right. And I am extremely grateful to him because I could represent that and let you who read the book think about his point of view. Now, I personally don't agree with some of the things he believes, but at the same time, the fact that he was willing to share it with me in a completely open and pretty earnest way, I thought had tremendous value. And so it's out in the world now. And one of the things that was important, and I found this throughout the book, there's this amazing moment when Nelson Johnson drives in 1987. The Klan is going to march again in Greensboro. And it was the first time they would have done something in Greensboro since the massacre. And Nelson decides to drive 70 miles into rural North Carolina to Mount Ula or Ula. How do you? I think I mispronounced that.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
And talked to the leader of the clan at that point and asked him not to come. And he ends up having this intense and conversation. It's quite traumatic, actually, and it's. But they're able to have a conversation in part because they're both rural people. Nelson grew up in a rural place in a hamlet called Shetterly in Halifax County, and these Klansmen obviously were rural from western North Carolina, or down near China Grove and Salisbury in that area. And they shared something of a common language. And I found that was true of me. I grew up in a rural place in rural Maine, and Cecil Moses and I could connect to some degree over being rural people, and that facilitated the conversation, even though, you know, we saw many things in the world very differently. So I just thought that was something interesting that was curiously helpful as I went through the book.
Backtracking a little bit, but this is something that we talked about earlier today. I mean, we've talked about how people not knowing about the massacre, how many people didn't know, how many people still don't know. And two-part question. First, although some of us know it, tell us what knocked it out of the news cycle. But also, on a more personal note, tell us how your wife, Margot Lee Shetterly, reacted when you told her what had happened. Because she didn't know about it either, any more than you did.
No, well, I mean, she was sitting with me in the cafe when we heard these stories.
She was actually there. Okay.
She was there with me. And so we both walked out, you know, and all three of us, my dad too, we all walked out sort of stunned by what we heard, and the fact that none of us, you know, knew about this history. And one of the things that I learned as I did this work is the degree to which Greensboro and has been important to Black liberation movement work for a long, long time, from the Underground Railroad, but how much of that history isn't really known, that isn't in the museums, and you have to walk somewhere else to hear it. For example, you know, Greensboro, when we talk about the Black Power movement, and we talk about Oakland, and we talk Detroit, Chicago, Greensboro should be in that conversation. I mean, this was a hub of Black Power. It wasn't a Black Panther place, but it was a place where people came purposely to understand how organizing could happen at a local and regional level. And Nelson Johnson, as a young person, was flying all over the country. He wasn't a leader that was seeking, in a sense, the limelight. He was a down-to-earth, you know, leather on the pavement kind of organizer. And so he really kept that focus. I came across this amazing interview from 1974 in which he's being interviewed on Tony Brown's show. You know that show I'm talking about?
Tony Brown's Journal.
Tony Brown's Journal? Yeah. And so at that table, among others, are Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, and Nelson Johnson, and all these other remarkable leaders. And he's there, and he's, you know, everyone else, all the other men are in suits. Nelson's in a green turtleneck, and he's sitting there, and he's just fidgeting. And basically, when he talks, you can tell he thinks, you know what, we're just talking too much. We need to get back on the street, you know? He's anxious to get back out there. And that's the kind of person he was. And that really sort of came back to me again and again in the interviews I did. But Greensboro was a place that people came to. And one of the reasons all of this happened is from the sit-ins on, the FBI thought of Greensboro as a place where things started and from which they spread. And so they paid extra attention to things happening in Greensboro. So, you know, if there's a Communist Party in Greensboro organizing in the mills, they're putting more attention on that than they would in a lot of other places. So anyway.
Should we turn it over to the audience?
Yeah, let's do that. Questions, answers, comments.
Yeah, I was there. I was here when that occurred, and so was she.
Yeah.
No, I had just gone home.
Well, but I mean,
I know, like I
you
was
were
there
around. And you
4
knew
days
what happened.
before and I left.
And at the time, I got the gist of it, that I never could or did figure out whether the police actually killed anybody or they just allowed the Klan to kill it at the time.
Sorry.
You wanna
No.
address that?
No, you finish.
Okay. So I had just moved here. I went to school in Indiana, got a master's degree in psychology, and I was idealistic. And came down here to work for a private nonprofit that ran group homes. And I supervised a group home. And this happened years later. This was in the 1980s. I had hired a young black guy who lived in the home, managed the kids. There were 5 kids in the home at a time, maximum. And they had an assigned van to drive around and, get here and there. Anyway, they were going down Church Street one day, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were pulled over. And no infraction, no speeding, no traffic violation noted, but they were pulled over anyway. And so a cop gets out of the car, goes up, talks to the driver, and his name Vince. And Vince was explaining to him who he was, what he did, and so forth. Well, the driver was intimating that they were driving a stolen van and wanted to see, all his credentials and so forth. Meanwhile, his partner had opened the door to the squad car and had pulled a gun that was pointed at Vince. And the kids saw it and got freaked out, understandably, by the whole situation.
Pardon me, were these disabled children or autistic, or were they troubled?
There was trouble at all. So this incident went on and said, well, anyway, when we got back and the kids calmed down and so forth, and I went over to talk to him, he explained what had happened. In my naivete, I thought, well, okay, I'll call the police department and ask for a mystery report. After all, an officer pulled a gun. Surely there was a mystery report. Talked to happened to be black female lieutenant at the police department, and she carefully and quietly took down what I was telling her about the incident. And I said, should I come there? Will you send the report here? No confirmation about any of that. So a couple days later, I called back to the police department because I didn't get any confirmation, no report. So I asked for it again. The following Monday, I was called into my office by my superior and questioned about it. I explained what had happened and so forth. And I thought this was an enlightened organization. I felt that he backed me up. Okay, the message I got is, Tom, you gotta let this go. If you don't, I'm gonna have to fire you. So, I understood then sort of how the power worked and how much accessibility the average citizen, law-abiding citizen could get from the police department of Greensboro. Incredible.
One of the parts I haven't really talked about is in what happened in 1979, as a lot of you probably know, the police had an informant in the Klan and were receiving reports about the fact that the Klan was probably going to come and they were probably going to be armed. That's one. But that informant in the Klan had also been an FBI informant previously. and was going to his old FBI handler and telling him all this information too. So there's two groups that knew, in a sense, what was possible. Then you had a Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms agent who had infiltrated the Klan group in Winston-Salem that came and was part of this. So you had at least 2 federal and 1 local law enforcement agency involved. My guess is the SBI knew a lot. You know, it's interesting. It's easier to get FBI records than SBI, State Bureau of Investigation. You can't. They're in a black box. You can't get them. Yeah. So when the decision is made at the top of the Greensboro Police Department to have a low-profile approach, right? Which they said, we made this decision because of all the riots that had happened in the late 60s, and we didn't want to agitate the protesters, the Communist Workers' Party folks. So we were going to stay out of sight, you know, far enough away that if we had to come, we could come. They already knew that the Klan was likely to come.
Yes.
When they made the decision, likely to come. Then, within a short period of time, within hours of this actually happening, they knew they were there. And they knew they had guns. And then they followed them all the way to the site, and no one stopped them. So this is, when we talk about why more people don't know about the Greensboro massacre, the next day, a true answer, but also not the whole answer, is the next day the hostages were taken at the American Embassy in Tehran. And all of a sudden, we could talk about us versus them instead of us versus us. Right. It was a lot easier to do, right?
I was a student at UNCG from September 77 until shortly before this happened. And shortly before I left, I bought a magazine on the cover were 2 Klansmen at an entrance to a building. Do you remember this? There's a picture. It's 2 Klansmen holding rifles. Either rifles or shotguns.
I've seen photos like that.
Huh? Yeah, but it was on the cover of a magazine. I'm like,
Was it a local magazine or
it
regional?
was a local. No, it was local. It was local to Greensboro. I don't remember what it was, but I remember buying it like shortly before I was going home. I could have even bought it like on the way to the airport or something. But I remember trying to do a paper that year on the KKK. And this is in UNC Greensboro, which is one of the largest college libraries on the East Coast. And I could not get a single book on the KKK or with articles on the KKK. And even when I went home and I was in the White Plains Library in New York, I did find a book and half of the pages with the pictures, they were ripped out. I mean, that's what it was like back then. It was just a little covered up.
I'm going to digress just slightly, but it touches on something that we mentioned earlier about the power of the police in Greensboro. The police chief at the time that Marcus Smith was killed, and somebody who was Wayne Scott, and I think he actually came into the police department after the Greensboro massacre. Is that true, Graham?
After the Greensboro massacre? Oh, yeah.
Did Scott? Yeah, Scott's tenure dates from after. Well, I mean, even as an entry-level police officer, it dates from after the Greensboro massacre. Anyway, and there were all these calls to fire Chief Scott, and you had Michelle Kennedy saying under deposition, when deposed, that she felt the cover-up had come from Chief Scott. You had Sharon Hightower saying to me that she thought it came from the city manager and the city attorney and other city leaders she would not name. But towards the end of Chief Scott's tenure, before he resigned, he was obviously at odds with city council. And there were people coming up, not to talk about the Marcus Smith case, but about a previous case of alleged police brutality and an officer who was allegedly responsible for that brutality, an officer whom we would now call publicly MAGA, although that wouldn't have been the term at the time. It was a 3%er and had a 3%er tattoo of the 3% of the population that supposedly opposed the British and the American Revolution. A man about whom multiple allegations had been made over the years. At this meeting, where people were talking about him, he was the appointed security at the city council meeting. He was standing in the back of the city council chamber, a big old shit-eating grin on his face. And I saw the text that the city manager, then city manager, sent to a city council member saying, Chief Scott is fucking with us. They've put this man in charge of this meeting as security. That showed you that the chief, even when he was on his way out, had the power to taunt our elected municipal leaders that way.
So one thing that happened, the mayor of Greensboro in 1979, I mean, it's similar. You see the way power gets exercised. Immediately said, nothing to see here. You know, two extremist groups having a fight. This has nothing to do with Greensboro. When I read that, that was one of the things that enticed me, right? To say, what? Okay, let me go figure out what this means, not only for Greensboro, but for all of us in this country, right? And I felt it means a lot. But more interesting, you know, almost in a way, is the governor at the time, Jim Hunt. Now, when I came across this nugget, I just couldn't believe it. It was too good to be true, right? It was almost like an onion piece. So I'm at the State Archives in Raleigh, and I'm going through Hunt's personal papers as governor, and I see that where was he on November 3rd, 1979? Because I was having trouble finding anything in the newspapers in which he's responding to this. So turns out he was in China selling tobacco to the Chinese. He was in Peking, now Beijing, right, in this old hotel. And he had just been that day, arrived there, stood before this huge poster of Chairman Mao to talk about, right, why North Carolina tobacco is the best tobacco, and the Chinese and North Carolina should be doing lots of trade together. So in the middle of the night, he's asleep in this old hotel, and a call comes in from his state security advisor here. It says, you know, those communists over at Duke, well, they just got shut up in Greensboro. And all of a sudden, you know, Burley Mitchell, who's then a Supreme Court justice here, right, who's making this call to Hunt, realizes that he's calling into communist China with this news about communists being shot in Greensboro, North Carolina. I mean, it's not funny, but it's, I mean, terrible, right? And funny, and it is funny. Anyway, so Hunt gets this information, and he says, well, what am I going to do? I've got like a week left on my Asian junket. I'm supposed to go to Japan and these other places and pitch more products and more tobacco. He's like, I'm going to keep my trip and not say anything. Now, the thing is that's really important about that is when the officials say there's nothing to see here or don't even respond, it affects how the media, you know, looks at something, right? If Hunt had come back and said, I need to come to Greensboro and we need to figure out what happened here and how to heal from this, there would have been media all over that. Absent. And it was kind of a brilliant move if you didn't want any coverage of this.
I do have a question. What is the state of the plan today in North Carolina? Do you know?
They allegedly have connections with the county that is ground zero for white supremacy, in my belief, in North Carolina, at least in flat North Carolina, which is Alamance County, where Sheriff Terry Johnson has been accused of being Klan affiliated.
Mm-hmm. From Alamance County, I work in Alamance County. I'm a teacher. I grew up in Alamance County. I grew up here my whole life. And my parents were from Caswell County, which is arguably worse. But I can definitely say that, you know, Terry Johnson has definitely had a chokehold in Alamance County when it comes to decisions being made. He's very powerful when it comes to politics there. And there has been a lot of rumors about him being connected to the Klan. The Klan is very active in Castle County. The Klan is very active in Alamance County. It's very active in Rockingham County. All those rural areas. But, you know, living here my whole life, I went to UNCG and local schools, they don't talk about local history like they should. And it's really concerning, you know, that we don't know as much as that we should. And the things that, you know, are taught are very cherry picked to show certain narratives. And so, you know, Alamance County and, you know, Greensboro County, they kind of hold hands, even though they have very similar histories. It's just Alamance County has been more rural for a longer time. So,
Yeah, during the Marcus Smith case, various people, various neo-Confederates from Alamance County were trolling the Yes Weekly Facebook page, attacking. And this shows you the power of perception. Their belief in Alamance County is that Greensboro was a black-led city where our Black Panther police chief, Wayne Scott's replacement, was literally in bed with our communist mayor, Nancy Vaughn. I mean, this is bullshit, of course, but I saw this on their secret Facebook groups and stuff. The neo-Confederates, some of the racists and Klansmen and stuff in Alamance County believe that Greensboro is this horrible communist place where we have a corrupt majority black police force that it has seduced the mayor.
and that persists today because, you know, when I went to UNCG, I lived in Alamance County for a time before I moved here because I had to work and go to school at the same time because I was in rural Alamance County. I don't have no money or anything. So, you know, when I was going to move here, my dad freaked out because, you know, that perception persists, even though, you know, they don't think that they were taught explicitly. It persists through, you know,
right. We got to you, right?
Yeah.
You're one of us now, right?
Well, I mean, I've always, even when I was younger, I've always, you know, been my own blue sheep. But, you know, it's just that, you know, it's interesting because, you know, my family feels like they escaped Caswell County going to Alamance County. And, you know, comparatively, they did. You know, because even in Caswell County, my uncle remembers when they desegregated the schools there, and it was rough. And so a lot of it has to do with ignorance. And, you know, just like Maya Angelou said, people know ignorance more than they know their own body odors.
That's a good quote.
And they don't want to let go.
Aran, Ian, it's 7:30.
Okay.
And I want to give people a chance to
Yes.
linger a bit and sign books.
Okay.
And maybe even buy books, we could say. So if you guys would like to kind of close it out.
Yes.
Can I say one more thing to that?
You go ahead.
One of the things that stunned me when I came here, you know, naive, not from here. We'll just lay out the facts and people say, oh. And I didn't realize the power of the social narratives and just how deep and how strong they are. And so when I got, you know, the former mayor on the phone, he starts yelling at me that I'm wasting everybody's time. Or I get a former managing editor of the newspaper who tells me no one knows who fired the first shot. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're a newspaper person.
Was that a former black man? I mean, a black former
No.
editor? Okay, it was white.
And but you understood that in a sense it was the story he had to tell to get access to the places in Greensboro where he wanted to go.
Right.
And I had so many experiences like that.
I don't mean to hold you over. One of the most frustrating things for me were the trials in mornings, 3 of them. Did the third trial, the jury selection where just anyone that was brown or black couldn't go to the jury. It was all white juries, and they were proud of it. They were explicitly excluding anyone that wasn't white. Did the third trial set precedents in some type of legal way so that couldn't happen again?
When there was 6-person jury on a civil trial, one African American person.
So
And that, if I could just say,
Yeah.
that largely had to do with a relatively liberal federal judge who I think was assigned there to give this one some credibility. And he was basically saying, I don't want to have another all-white jury cover this thing up.
and sort of ensured
That's
that Black
exactly right.
Wow.
And the next year, there was a Supreme Court case that then called Batson that disallowed this, in which the Greensboro situation was part of the consideration in that case.
But the two criminal trials, it was all white juries, and black jurors were explicitly excluded for being black.
I know we have to wrap things up,
Yeah.
but I have two things. What makes
Yeah.
you guys want to write the book? And also, when will white people realize that racism affects us all? Of course, black people and brown people are hurt the worst, but everybody is hurt when it comes to
Yes.
racism.
I'll answer first because it's easy, it's simple. I fell into it. I wrote an article, and then I wrote another article, and then I wrote another article because my editor at the time wanted as much publicity, wanted to let me write anything I wanted to write. And before I knew it, I had 60 of them. And then the case was dragging on. And Scuppernong Editions, their publishing arm, asked me to write a book. His is a bit different. And I don't know.
Well,
I don't know the answer to your last question.
to be honest with
I
you,
hope.
I felt this felt very personal to me. It didn't feel like I was just going to tell someone else's story. I felt like by hearing their story, I was going to understand better who I was as an American, because this is me too. And I came to deeply feel that, even more than I expected. That, and I say in the book at one point, the fact that I didn't know began to feel sort of criminal to me, right? Is that it wasn't just an accident I didn't know. It was purposeful that we don't know so much of this history. And when you don't know your history, it limits what you can do, because you don't know, and me too. Now, not just the objects, the direct objects, but all of us are affected by it. And it limits how we can imagine the place we want to live in. And that's something that is so important right now, right? That we can all imagine the place we want to live in. It's been disrupted. It's open. We can begin to recreate things here in a new way, and we have to do it.
I'm old enough that in grade school, my fifth grade textbook said that slaves were better off in America, and that the Union Army it had a drawing of a typical Union soldier with a hooked nose, tangled black beard, and it described Union soldiers as foreigners invading the South. That was the education. That was my public education in the 1960s.
Thank you.
Thank you.